Interviewing with high-performing companies, some candidates choose to differentiate themselves from the rest by doing things which others may find too difficult or using techniques which are new. And I'm going to share with you a number of these ideas for you to consider for your upcoming job interview. The first one relies on the statistical evidence that 95% of candidates fail building a story bank that's good enough by their own standards, which basically means if only 5% of candidates end up having a story bank while going to the final round of interviews with high-performing companies, then it means one approach you may want to consider would be to share your story bank with your interviewers before, during, or after your job interview. Furthermore, if you would do this, you would also improve your chances to build trust with the interviewing panel because you have nothing to hide, so to speak. All right, so this would be the first approach, the first technique, which not many other candidates are willing to employ in these job interviews. The second technique, which is probably more accessible and addresses a larger audience, would be with respect to your star answers. What happens in these job interviews is most candidates would like to enrich, so to speak, their star answers by adding a few learnings, by adding a few metrics, which is, all fine advice, but there are some lesser known techniques to enrich your star answers. I'm going to present you with some ideas here. The first one would be to over-communicate the highlights that you want to transmit in your answer. So for example, if you have a very interesting metric, you could communicate it twice in the same answer. First in the situation, you would start, basically with some achievements with that interesting metric, and then you would ensure they remember your key highlight by also mentioning it during the results. Okay, so by over-communicating something, you will ensure your answers will be more memorable. Right? This requires a little bit of role play, and this also requires that you know what you're doing, so to speak. Right? The second technique that still not many candidates utilize in these job interviews, and a technique which is most appropriate for senior and executive level roles, would be to dramatize in the beginning of your answers. By dramatizing and by creating a bit of contrast between the tough situation you are into and your ability to diffuse that tough situation with some great achievements, will be perceived as a superior answer when compared to a rather flat star answer, right? So dramatizing things. The third technique that especially salespeople use in job interviews would be to intentionally omit some key details of your story in a bid to invite conversation. Right, so if you remember the first thing I said, to over-communicate the key highlights, what if you hide some key metrics from your answers? It's inevitable that your interviewer will have to follow up, asking you for, hey, what were some interesting results you can share with us, right? And therefore you would build a conversation, and for a salesperson this would be an interesting achievement, so to speak, because that's when they get the most value, the most benefit, right? Of course, this assumes you are rather skilled at interviewing to begin with, but it's a highly efficient technique, right? And the fourth technique I wanted to share with you with respect to star answers, something again that no amount of AI will recommend you, would be to reverse your star answer. That is, to start with the results and that go backwards from there. If you try it out, you'll see it makes sense with some minor adjustments, right? So by getting creative, by building a candidate brand in the way you present your answers, you will be perceived as a better candidate. And maybe one more piece of advice To close this, if you feel like the way you deliver your interview answers lacks energy, one method you would want to employ to stand out in these job interviews would be to literally stand during your interviews while delivering your answers. Because if you deliver them while standing, it's also the energy levels that will improve as well. And it's a technique that it's oftentimes used by executives and by people who give interviews, so to speak. Right, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.